Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to Unlearning Economics. Today I have with me Professor Elizabeth Popp Berman, who is the author of Thinking Like an Economist, How Efficiency Replaced Equity in US Public Policy. And we're going to talk about that book and the role of economists and much more today. So, Professor Berman, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here with you.
So let's start with a pretty basic question about this book. How would you define thinking like an economist?
Sure. Yeah. So the way I use it in the book, I talk about what I call an economic style of reasoning, which is really kind of a very basic microeconomic approach to thinking about problems. So nothing too sophisticated, nothing too advanced, but really sort of thinking about incentives and opportunity costs and thinking about efficiency as a measure of good policy. So that it's really kind of just taking this orientation to problems where you say, okay, are there spaces we can make things more efficient or cost effective? How do we thinking at the margins, just sort of these basic concepts that you would learn in Econ 101 and applying them to these different real world contexts.
I think one of the things that you see about thinking like an economist, maybe when you read a book like Freakonomics or The Undercover Economist, some of the famous pop economics books, especially the first wave of them, is like its applicability to everything. So they'll say like, now you're thinking like an economist when if you're thinking about allocating your time over the day, you're thinking, oh, well, I'm going to the shops, but what's the opportunity cost of going to the shops? What's the next
Right.
best alternative? So it reframes everything, right, in terms of like trade-offs. Doing one thing means you can't do another thing, and trying to attach values to those trade-offs. Do you think that's accurate?
Right. And it's super useful for what it does, right?
Mm.
But it kind of comes into conflict sometimes with other kinds of ways of thinking about problems. And so, so what I'm writing about is these policy spaces,
Mm.
and in particular, that you have all these policy domains where that kind of thinking like an economist was once really foreign, right? Of course, there's spaces where you have a long history of economic thinking and things like fiscal policy or monetary policy, but in lots of spaces like social policy or environmental policy, this sort of way of thinking in terms of trade-offs and opportunity costs and cost effectiveness really was once quite foreign to people.
Mm.
And it's been quite a while now since that shifted, but there was a point where people didn't know how to do it, and it sort of had to be brought in and introduced. And once it became a common way of thinking about problems, that really changed the way that those policy spaces were structured.
Yeah, I mean, on a purely personal level, the thinking like an economist thing, I find I don't find it that good a guide to everyday life, because if you're always thinking about what you could have been doing instead of what you're doing now, that sounds like a recipe for like anxiety and depression, to be honest. It's like it's pretty stressful to think like an economist. But you mentioned the environment, so this stood out to
Mm-hmm.
me in your book as an example, right? So let's talk a little bit about it in the Clean Air Act, because this is
Mm-hmm.
illustrative of the shift to thinking like an economist, right?
Right. Right. So in the US space, right, you had a big wave of environmental policy that started around 1970-ish, around Earth Day, and you had these big pieces of legislation passed. The Clean Air Act, you have the Clean Water Act, and these are pieces of policy that are really focused on trying to um, just say, well, one, they had kind of a moral component to them, and that they sort of as a baseline assumption that pollution is bad, right? We should just tell companies not to do it. And that if you were going to try to reduce it, the way to do that is to say, okay, well, either we want the levels to be zero, or we want it to have, we want to decide we don't want to have any impact on human health, that you sort of decide here is the outcome we want. And so we're just going to like set the pollution level so that we can get there. And so that's kind of how that wave of environmental legislation was set up. And of course it was quite effective, and you did have a lot of reductions in pollution that took place over the 70s and 80s, as a result of that. However, what it didn't do is it really didn't think about the costs of reducing pollution at all, and it didn't think about it didn't think about marginal costs in particular. And so while at the time that that was being put into place, economists didn't really have much, if any, voice in environmental policy. But they're certainly pointing it out at the time. They just weren't necessarily, they just weren't necessarily particularly influential in that space. But they were saying, look, well, I mean, reducing pollution, sure, pollution is bad, but reducing it has costs as well as benefits. And, you need to take those costs into account. And you need to recognize that, the further you push down pollution, those marginal costs are going to increase. And so, you really need to, you really don't want to just be saying, okay, here's the level we're shooting for, and let's go for that. You really want to be saying, okay, how do we think about what an optimal level is where we're sort of balancing out the costs and benefits? Then eventually this kind of, downstream goes even further to thinking about things like emissions trading and sort of creating markets for emissions credit that kind of lay the groundwork for thinking about cap and trade kind of system. So all of this is kind of a very different way of thinking about how to solve environmental problems that, again, is very compelling in some ways, but also that that then introduces different sets of issues and different kinds of complications.
I think we can all appreciate that thinking about the costs of environmental regulations or any regulations and trying to evaluate the whole thing is a good idea, right? But I hear that what I'm hearing is that really the economic way of thinking was a bit more than that. That was kind of the I don't know, the thin end of the wedge, right? To say let's just think about costs, but then you end up with this very specific approach to environmental regulation. So like things like cap and trade. I mean, you discussed the sulfur dioxide cap and trade scheme, right? And how that was one of the main environmental regulations, whereas the Clean Air Act, which was much more by fiat, just don't do this, don't emit this much pollution, you're just not allowed to do it, it's banned, right? That was that fell into relative disfavor and was kind of watered down, right?
Yeah, and I think one thing that often happens in a lot of these spaces is that one big piece that the economic style of reasoning is often missing is kind of the political piece of these decisions, right? That sometimes simple rules that may not, in theory, be the most efficient option. I mean, there may be situations where they're easier to implement. It may be more straightforward. I think a lot of times when you're talking about building some kind of complex system for decision making, whether that's either some really complex weighing of costs and benefits as you're making regulatory decisions, or whether it's building this whole apparatus for for creating a market around something like emissions trading. I think that can that introduces a lot of space for politics, right? And so particularly in situations where you're talking about regulating industries, you have industries that are very financially invested in what the outcomes of these are, and you don't necessarily have the same sort of weight of interest groups acting in pursuit of some kind of public interest. And so the more complex and the more opaque these processes are, I think the more space there can be to for interest groups to intervene. And so you're designing something because you think in this sort of like ideal world, it's going to be the most efficient solution and it's going to be better than some sort of fiat. Let's just say this is the level. But if in fact what you're doing is introducing a lot of the space in which people can quietly lobby to decide what those goals are, or decide exactly how that market's going to be structured, that introduces other kinds of problems that aren't really recognized within that economic framework.
If there's a limit on how much carbon dioxide you can emit, then you just can't emit above that amount, right? And that's pretty simple. It's straightforward. If you've broken that rule, then you've broken it. But once you start designing, what's the cost of emission in some of these schemes, how can you trade them, how many there are going to be, all of that kind of stuff, then you get a lot of room for industry lobbying and effectively corruption. I mean, one of the examples that I was reading about not too long ago was Tesla, right? Because Tesla for a long time was only profitable because they were selling their emissions rights to fossil fuel emitting car companies, right? So it was like, yeah, your cars are electric, but through that reduction in emissions, you're granting the right to the existing incumbents to actually emit more. And so that's, that doesn't necessarily have a net reduction in the amount emitted, or at least not as much as we'd like.
Yeah, no, and that's another argument that people have made, that while, I mean, again, the sort of the ideal here would be that you are saying, okay, well, here's our optimal level of emissions that we want as a society, and we're going to set it there and have our credits to meet that. One thing that happens when you sort of create a flat number is that in fact everybody has to do a little bit better than that, and so the standard ends up being a little more aggressive with these absolute numbers, right? So if you imagine that if everybody had to meet the same standard and Tesla couldn't sell its credits, then you'd have, I don't know who, if it's Ford or whoever it is that they're selling their credits to, would simply have to meet the same cap, and you would be achieving lower levels overall.
Do you think that the costs of these mandates, the pre-Economist type regulations, have been overstated? Because I sometimes wonder about this, and in a way, my kind of semi-troll perspective on this is that people have too little faith in capitalism when they say that these are going to be the end of companies, these are going to create massive costs. Because I think if you did manage to, let's say over the medium to long term, ban carbon dioxide emission, I think what you'd find is you would actually spur quite a lot of innovation, right? And you would have, companies would find ways around this. And that strikes me as a real shortcoming of the economic approach, because I feel like it hasn't taken that into account.
Yeah. And I mean, and this was sort of an explicit piece of how people were thinking about it in the 1970s too, was this idea of technology forcing, right? That if you set the regulations so that the limits are at a certain place, you're going to force companies to adopt a technology that is maybe less polluting, that they wouldn't necessarily have adopted otherwise. So this isn't even necessarily about inventing entirely new technologies to solve problems, but just pushing people, pushing companies to accelerate how quickly they're adopting less polluting technologies. And I do agree. I mean, I think it really in general tends to neglect the potential for innovation, the ways that companies might come up with alternative ways of meeting goals if they were forced to do that, right? I mean, of course, they're not going to prefer to do that if it's less expensive not to have to, but I think often the costs in reality might not be as much as they look like they would be at the time that you're making the decision.
Aside from the political limitations and the sort of technological forcing, as you called it, that we just discussed, are there any other major limitations of this approach to specifically environmental policy?
I mean, I guess the one that is a little bit front of mind right now is just that if you think about some of the Supreme Court decisions that are happening in the U.S., that we're sort of in this position right now where the Supreme Court is looking at the Chevron doctrine, which is sort of obscure and not something that most people who aren't lawyers are paying attention to. But it's the idea that a lot of this authority to sort of make these kinds of technical decisions has been delegated to these federal agencies, and now we're in the position where the Supreme Court may say, no, that's not okay. And we, the Supreme Court, in fact, have sort of advisory, authority over reviewing this stuff and can kind of just reject it. So by virtue of saying we're going to create a fairly complex system for, using expertise and technical knowledge to set these levels and set these outcomes, and we're not going to, that we're going to sort of move this from decisions that are happening in the space of Congress to decisions that are happening in the executive branch. Now you've also kind of had this opening for another branch of government to say, nope, we're going to just sort of get rid of that whole system. We don't believe that the executive branch has the authority to do this. And so now we're going to take it into our own hands to decide what is reasonable and what is not. So that's kind of a very downstream consequence, and certainly not one I think that people would have been thinking about even a few years ago. But if you're relying on federal agencies to be making the decisions that are going to create these standards, then if you end up in a political space where that's no longer possible for them to do, then basically you have no way to implement those standards. The US has no way
Mm.
to have a carbon policy, for example.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think I mean, again, it's just an insufficient appreciation of the political. I think economists could be accused for a long time of living in this kind of technocratic fairy tale where they can adjust things, perfectly, and that it doesn't have to be filtered through the political realities of whichever country they're in.
Right, exactly.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I mean, this is a US specific problem and specific to this moment, but it's a big one
Yeah.
nevertheless.
I think this idea of trade-offs as well, which is related to opportunity cost that we were talking about at the beginning, is really important because I think so. I've got here Greg Mankiw in his widely used introductory textbook, probably still the best-selling economics textbook of all time, although don't quote me on that. But he begins the book with 10 principles of economics, and the first is that people face trade-offs. He talks about efficiency and equality conflicting. There's this idea that efficiency conflicts with equality or equity, right, which is kind of referenced in the subtitle of your book. And he actually uses the example of environmental regulations incurring costs as well, right? But it strikes me that, and again, this is kind of what we've been talking about. There are some clear examples of trade-ons, right? What you could call trade-ons. There are examples where two goals aren't in conflict, right? You can pursue something which is good for reduces pollution perhaps, and that's good for people's health, which is another outcome, and then it can be good for productivity as well at work. And there are just like, I think this fetishization of trade-offs has played quite a big role, and actually sometimes you can have your cake and eat it too. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, no, and I think I think often, right, one thing that kind of gets overlooked in the trade-offs conversation is, yes, there can be trade-offs, but often you're not counting everything, and so there may be benefits that there are going to be benefits that just aren't possible to count within sort of a standard economic framework. And
Mm.
by not counting those, then you're effectively kind of ignoring them. And I think ones that I think about sometimes are things that are sort of involve some kind of social solidarity or some kind of developing some sense of common interest. So if you think about something like again, like the US has for like decades had periodic debates over some kind of universal health insurance, right? And and at one point, the sort of, decades ago, the sort of standard democratic position was we want to give everybody, we want to have universal health insurance. We want to cover everybody. And, there were political arguments for this, but there's also this sort of idea that you're kind of helping that if you create a society in which everybody has access to healthcare, then you are you're sort of strengthening the social fabric.
Mm.
You have sort of a greater sense of social solidarity. You maybe have a little more, faith that government could do something. I mean, I think like the NHS, right, for all its issues, people also have a lot of appreciation for
Mm.
having some kind of national healthcare system. Um, the economic approach ended up kind of focusing on, well, how do we do this cost effectively, right? And so we want to think about, oh, well, who should be cost sharing in this, right? People who can afford to buy their own health insurance, government shouldn't be paying for that because that's not a very cost effective way to do it. Thinking about things like moral hazard, but and so if you just talk about trade-offs, then that's sort of what you focus on. But there are these other things that are difficult to measure, right? And there's no real way to measure, okay, well, what's the effect on the social fabric of like having healthcare, that having everybody have access to healthcare or not.
Mm.
It's just not possible to quantify in a very meaningful way. But if you just focus on the trade-offs that you can easily measure, then sometimes you miss these big things that are also positive impacts, just because they're not possible to quantify in the same way.
I would state it. I mean, I agree. I would state it even more strongly though, because I mean, one of the things you mentioned that just now, when you talk about in the book, is moral hazard, right? Moral hazard in healthcare, and this is just a case where the economic way of thinking has been shown to be wrong. I mean, I think it's ridiculous, the idea that I have health insurance, so what? I walk out in front of a bus, like, you know, it's nobody's going to do that, and there isn't really very much evidence for it, because I actually reviewed the health economics literature not too long ago, and it seems that the verdict is no, there isn't any real scale of moral hazard from introducing healthcare coverage, because of what I just said. It doesn't happen, right? So I think it's like these highly technical arguments, there's been a bit of a deference to them, but they don't always hold up. They might just not be true. Just because you have a neat theory doesn't mean that it actually happens, right?
And yeah, and I think this is also where it is, like I said, sort of, it can be sometimes like an Econ 101 way of thinking about problems instead of a more sophisticated way, even within sort of
Yeah.
a purely economic framework of thinking about problems, that, you introduce the idea to somebody who's never heard it and you say, oh, moral hazard, people are gonna use more healthcare if they don't have to pay for it. And somebody might say, oh yeah, I never thought about it that way, and then it kind of resonates and so like in policy spaces, this is the kind of idea that, right, it is like this sort of Freakonomics idea. It's a little bit counterintuitive, it's a little bit makes you feel like you're smart because you're thinking about it this way, you're thinking about it more deeply than everybody else.
Yeah.
But if you actually go out and look at the empirics of it, maybe it turns out it's not, there's not a lot of evidence that's actually what's going on. And so again, I mean, so I think there can kind of be this disconnect between this sort of basic economic reasoning that becomes very popular in policy circles and, sometimes what people in discipline are actually doing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like, yeah, it is Freakonomic stuff. Tech bros love it, right? It's like that kind of semi-scientific sounding, intuitive, or well, counterintuitive idea, but that becomes intuitive for them because they start thinking in that way, and it does make you sound really insightful. But yeah, again, not necessarily true. So one thing I want to talk about with you is the limits, maybe, of the economic way of thinking. Because as you make clear throughout your book and also in papers I've read by you, it's like economists right now have quite a lot of influence. Maybe they were at the peak of their influence around 2010, I don't know, but there have always been limits, right? And it's easy to think of it as this kind of gradual coup by economists, right? And in one way it was, but one thing your book shows is that there were so many false starts, and there were setbacks, and there were, there are still areas, immigration might be one, for instance, where economists just don't really have that much influence. So could you maybe speak to like some of the limits and the challenges that the economic way of thinking has faced, and why that might be? Which areas doesn't it have any success in infiltrating?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could think of this both, right, in terms of different policy spaces, right? That there are just policy areas where economics is more influential than others. The other one where I think, that it's very clear that economics is not particularly influential is defense policy, where it's this enormous part of the total budget, but decisions seem to be based on entirely other criteria. You never hear conversations about cost effectiveness of defense spending.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because historically, I mean, the Defense Department was kind of an important path for economists to enter into government more broadly, but the influence just didn't have the same kind of lasting impact in that space that it did in a lot of other places. I mean, so you could talk about like variation across policy domains, but then there is also this bigger question of, you've also got, different administrations that are just sort of embraced or rejected economic reasoning to a greater or lesser degree. And, historically, I think in the US, you've got a little bit of a Republican Democrat divide where Democrats have sort of been more amenable to using the economic style, and Republicans have been sort of better at using it strategically, or sort of using it when it aligns with other things they want to do, and rejecting it under other circumstances. But then I think most recently, right, in the past, since the the Trump era, you also have a position that's very much about let's just reject economic thinking entirely. Let's just sort of say this is out the window. This is not how we're seeing the world anymore.
Mm.
And, you could see that by the people who Trump appointed to the Council of Economic Advisors, the people from very different spaces, not necessarily part of the same intellectual communities. So, right. So you both have like this sort of variation in time over how much influence economics has had in different policy areas, but then also the very real potential that a particular administration might just ditch economic expertise entirely. And I guess one other kind of different angle on this would be spaces within the Biden administration where there has been sort of pushback on economic reasoning too. And I think the big one where this has been very conflictual has been antitrust policy, right? Where Biden has appointed people for the first time in several decades who are kind of very much not taking a standard economic approach to thinking about antitrust and competition and thinking about how markets should be governed, and that has created a lot of conflict. I think both within the administration and with the businesses that are going to be regulated. But I think it's another example of this isn't just a one-way street. You can kind of go back and forth in terms of having economic reasoning being more adopted for a while in particular times and spaces, but it can also be reversed or pushed back or rejected.
Yeah, I want there's a lot to talk about there. I want to come back to maybe the modern developments, but one thing I want to highlight that you touched on there is the fact that although the economic way of thinking is often associated with the right wing, it was actually introduced by kind of lefty people. Now, not like super lefty people, like center lefty people, right?
Right.
And what you actually see is that the center left people seem to have been more consistent in advocating it, no matter what the outcomes, right? Believing in it. But then when the right come into power, and this is also true with Trump to an extent, it's like they embrace it where it suits them, i.e. with deregulation, right? Which it can tend to support deregulation, but not all the time. And then they just discard it when it doesn't. So could you maybe describe that process of like how it emerged and how it's been used or abused by the different parties?
Yeah. I mean, and one motivation for me in writing this book was that I felt like the story of, at least the story on the political side of, the influence of economics was too much of one about kind of Chicago school free markets, right? Rise of neoliberalism, that this was kind of that was sort of the dominant narrative that people were talking about. But, when I was looking at what was going on, it was really these kind of center left technocrat types of people who had a really important and sort of independent role in shifting things. And so, what I think you see is that economic reasoning, as it does kind of spread in Washington in the 1960s and 70s, is predominantly coming from the center left spaces. And so it's people who are primarily in democratic administrations. They want to use government to try to achieve social outcomes. They just think that they have kind of a newer and better way of doing it than the traditional, what you might think of more traditional left approach that might be taken by other parts of the Democratic Party. And so, so on the one hand, you have this dynamic where, what it means in practice is often sort of pointing to these more traditional democratic approaches or left approaches, something that is focused on universalism or something that has policy goals that aren't primarily centered around cost effectiveness, and saying, this is not the optimal way to do this. We should be taking a different approach to thinking about this. But in practice, what that often meant was sort of scaling things back, reining things in, kind of limiting the scope of what what government was trying to do. And so it did often put these folks into this natural alliance with the center right, at least, not necessarily the far right. But so, for example, you see in the Nixon administration, you see a lot of these center left folks find themselves becoming very natural and unexpected allies with the Nixon administration, because a lot of the Nixon administration is not trying to get rid of social programs entirely. It's trying to rein things in a little bit, sort of amenable to the idea that maybe one way to do that is by rationalizing social programs. And so, so what you see in effect is that a set of people who sort of see themselves as being left of center end up having the effect of sort of moving the center of policy towards the right. And so that is a dynamic I think you see repeatedly across Democratic administrations. I mean, I think you see it all the way up until the Obama administration. And by contrast, I think starting with the Reagan administration, you see Republicans take a much more strategic approach to, again, kind of going along with economic reasoning, like you said, for example, in those situations where it's pointing towards deregulation and sort of saying, yes, this is what we want to do, so we're gonna embrace this, and rejecting it and saying, hey, maybe that's not what we want to look to as our starting point or our orientation towards problems, if it looks like it's going to point to policy outcomes that they weren't otherwise looking for.
I mean, a good example in the UK is Brexit, right? Because there's by any credible measure, Brexit is going to have a negative economic effect. I think there was a study at LSE that estimates that it accounts for about 30% of our inflation last year, right? And our inflation's a lot higher than most rich industrialized countries. That's one reason why our cost of living crisis is really bad, and that was kind of predicted by economists. It's actually the one thing that macroeconomists have been right about for about 50 years, but the right just dropped it. They just dropped. Whereas in other referendums, like the Scotland referendum, they'd been like, no, leaving the union, leaving the pound will be bad for Scotland. It will be bad for the economy. Now it was like, oh, it doesn't matter. There's more to life than money. We can stand on our own 2 feet. All the economic forecasts are wrong. We hate experts and blah blah. It was just a startling about face. And I think one thing that has happened, I think, and this goes back to Trump as well. I think there has been a permanent impact of that debate. I feel like the right have reoriented themselves in recent years away from economics and more just towards like culture war issues. Now, I don't want to discuss culture war issues with you, right. But I mean, is that something that you agree with? Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's hard to separate from just that there's been kind of a rise of right-wing populism in general, right? And that I think that goes hand in hand with kind of a rejection of expertise, which, to the extent that economists have had one of the more influential forms of expertise in policy spaces, has been a rejection of economics. So I don't know, what the cause and effect is there, but I think definitely to the extent that we have a new and different kind of right wing now, that's going to continue to be more detached from economics and economic expertise than it used to be.
I mean, do you think that having a detached technocratic class can fuel this type of populism? And some of the blame, not all of it, obviously, some of it lays at the feet of economists who, as we've discussed, didn't have any appreciation of politics, social cohesion, democracy, or anything like that.
I mean, I suppose it could, right? I don't think I would want to excuse the technocrats entirely from having some culpability here, but I also do think that right, it's also a shift that makes technocratic expertise start to look pretty good by comparison, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Choices are, right?
Yeah.
Would you rather have the people who are not sufficiently concerned with but are still kind of trying to
yeah.
So I have mixed feelings in that space.
Yeah. That's completely fair, I think. So I mean, I want to talk about efficiency versus other values. So I suppose we've gotten quite a long way in, and I haven't actually asked you to define efficiency yet. But one of your repeated points throughout the book is like efficiency is a value. It's one value. There are lots of other values, right? And we've touched on this. But one of your examples which really struck me, and I just didn't know about this. So we've got the war on poverty in the USA, right? And before thinking like an economist, there was this idea of empowering communities, right? Which was quite inherently kind of democratic, driven by those communities. And this shifted to first to just what you were talking about before, which is just getting the most bang for your buck, right? The most cost-effective way to end poverty using probably centralized welfare payments or something like that. And then perhaps during the Reagan years, it shifted even more to making sure that people who were on benefits got back to work fast enough, right? As fast as possible. So how do you think this evolution related to the focus on efficiency?
Yeah, I mean, I think right. So on the front end of this, when you're talking about the very early period of the war on poverty in the U.S., so this is like 1963 or so, 1964. You're really, the war on poverty kind of launched with this idea of community action and this kind of uh, really theory of why poverty existed and how to get rid of it. And so the idea was that, that poverty, the starting point was not seeing poverty as primarily a problem of just not having enough income. It was a community problem, and it was related to sort of community needs and partly to an absence of political voice. And so part of the idea was, okay, we're going to empower communities to kind of identify what their needs are, advocate for themselves, so that they can get the types of resources they need that are going to help to, to move those communities out of poverty. And this was, this was pretty historically unusual. It was sort of, a different approach to the problem than had been taken in the past. And it quickly turned out to create political complications of its own, namely that it was kind of successful in some ways. And so what you ended up having these communities kind of getting together and like banging on the door of their mayors and demanding that they have changes and demanding that things look different. And sometimes this resulted in bigger conflicts too. I mean, this is also the period where you've got various urban uprisings going on. So this is intersecting with race in the U.S. This is intersecting with a lot of stuff. But the short version here is that by empowering communities, the communities were mostly then yelling at their Democratic mayors, who were kind of aligned with Johnson in the White House, who was overseeing this, and so. Johnson, who's sort of leading the war on poverty, all of a sudden has all his mayors who are his allies calling up his office saying, "What the heck is this? We this you're turning people against us," and it becomes this political problem. And so, at the same time, you've got a lot of economists who are kind of floating around in this same policy space who have a very different way of thinking about the problem. Aren't particularly interested in like the political voice piece or the strengthening the social fabric piece, and really see poverty as an income problem, right? If people are poor because they don't have enough money. And so what ends up happening is that by advocating for, so sort of say, what's a good poverty policy look like? Well, it's one that gets money to people as quickly and efficiently as possible. So maybe that's just a negative income tax. It's some kind of straightforward income support that doesn't have all this other stuff attached to it. And so it becomes both it becomes an approach that both makes sense under its own logic, but that also solves a political problem. And in particular, because race is such an important piece of poverty in the US as well, it also helps you sort of sidestep this explosive issue of race at the same time by just saying, we're not going to address that, we're not going to talk about that, we're just going to send people money, not try to give them political voice, because that's just going to create problems for us. And so that really ends up helping to solve a political problem, even if it's taking a different approach to the social problem that it's trying to solve.
Yeah, it sounds very much like, when we said democracy, we didn't mean that type of democracy, right?
Too much
Yeah,
democracy,
too much
right?
democracy. I mean, it's a bit challenging for me because I'm a bit of a fan of universal basic income, mostly on the grounds that almost every piece of evidence I've read about it just shows that it has really good effects on bunch of stuff and not very many bad effects, right? I mean, am I falling victim to this thinking like an economist framing?
Well, no, I mean, I don't think, right, like, I don't think these are necessarily, like, none of these ideas are inherently good and bad in and of themselves, right? Like,
Mm,
there are specific ways of thinking about problems. And, there may be instances where they are the most effective policy, even evaluated in very broad terms, right? Even thinking about things much more broadly than just, are we getting people's incomes to a certain level? I mean, what I would argue is just that you need is not to abandon these ideas wholesale. It's
mm,
that you want to be thinking very broadly about what their impacts are. So, so that you're not just thinking about income or even something relatively narrow like effects on health or educational outcomes or something like that, but that you're really trying to think, um, you know, what are the broader political consequences
mm.
of this? What are the broader social consequences of this, including understanding that some of those may be hard to measure, sort of difficult to evaluate in the same kinds of ways that you would evaluate an outcome like, low birth weight, something that's very measurable, and really trying to evaluate them through a broad lens rather than a very narrowly economic lens.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you need combinations of different experts, different social scientists, natural scientists, depending on the question, as well as like democratic accountability, right? And that's one way to ensure that all the different values are balanced beyond just the economics ones. Yeah. So one theme which has come up, right, and we've just binned High Speed Rail 2 in the UK. I don't know if you followed that, or we binned most of it actually. So High Speed Rail 2 was a pet project of the Conservative government from 2011, and they're they're so incompetent that the costs. I think the estimated cost was like 30 billion at the start. By the time they decided to bin it off, it was over 100 billion, right? And the thing is, I've looked in depth at the cost benefit analysis for this. Now, cost benefit analysis is arguably one of the primary tools of this way of thinking, right? You see this in policy all the time. Reagan enshrined, I think, that major new regulations had to pass cost benefit analysis. Cass Sunstein, technocrat in
Mm-hmm.
chief, wrote a book called The Cost Benefit Revolution, right? So it really is the language of economics in policy, I think, perhaps more so than any other method. But the thing about the CBA for High Speed 2 is that it was rubbish. And it was just so suspect, and they didn't follow the guidelines properly, and it was pushed through anyway. And they made the numbers. What is it? Tortured the numbers until they confessed, right? But so they got a positive benefit to cost ratio, but that's not the point. So my question to you is, to what degree do you think that the economic way of thinking actually has an independent influence on policy, as opposed to just being a cover for politicians to do what they want? And I think that goes back to like the welfare stuff we were talking about in the 60s, because there were obviously issues about race then as well, and probably issues that especially Nixon really wanted to escape, and maybe he just used the economic way of thinking as cover. So I mean, is that true, or is there a more subtle influence here?
I mean, I think I would say two things about that. One is that that uh, right that I think pure power politics is always going to win in the end, right? That yes, numbers are manipulable. If there is enough politically at stake, people will find ways to advance the thing that they want, regardless of what the economics says. That I think applies across the political spectrum. I think that's just the nature of politics. Now, that's not to say that there aren't a lot of situations where not quite as much is at stake, and that people really do sort of, um, you know, take the numbers into account. You know, it may lead them to choose one path rather than another. So I think it matters and it can affect decisions. It's just that ultimately it can be outweighed by other kinds of political forces when interests are strong enough. But the other way that I think it really matters is in terms of reorienting conversations, right? Where this becomes the thing that you have to talk about in order to move a policy forward. And, you know, I think the historical example I like to think about here is that, you know, when Medicare was created in the US in 1865, so, you know, for anybody not familiar, Medicare is the health insurance for everybody who is over 65 in the US, which was created in 1965 and is still exists in its current form. You know, this was created before the cost benefit language was kind of such an integral part of policymaking. And I don't know if it could have passed if it happened at another point in time, because that would have become the thing that you had to talk about is, you know, what are the projections about how much this is going to cost 10 years down the 20 years down the road. It just sort of makes cost benefit weighing the primary lens that you have to understand problems through, and then other kinds of reasons that you might do it become kind of secondary to that, right? Like if we can get the cost right, then we can also do this thing that we want to do. But first, we've got to talk about this. So I do think, to the extent that it centers a particular set of issues and forces those to the center of the stage. Yes, if there's enough at stake, you know, you can kind of overcome that anyway, but it makes it much more central to the decision-making process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I mean, one of the things about cost-benefit analysis as well is like, I feel like it's often a bit of a lie, not just because the methods are questionable, but because I think when you do a cost-benefit analysis, it's usually in like terms of, you know, dollars and cents or pounds or whatever. It's money. And, you know, do the benefits outweigh the costs? Is it going to make more money than we spend? Is the way that people interpret that. But actually, cost-benefit analysis isn't about affordability when it's done in the public sector. It's not, because what you do is you get a wide range of outcomes like transport times and environmental outcomes, and you find a way to attach monetary value to them. So they're not actually making money, but a park, for instance, has a monetary value, an area of outstanding natural beauty, as we call them in the UK. You know, they have a value attached to them, but they're not actually necessarily making that money. And I think this is a way of measuring like social value. And it's just one way, but I think people can easily be fooled into thinking cost-benefit analysis is about affordability and just cost effectiveness when really it's not. It's just a way of measuring different outcomes in society and applying that method. And once you realize that, you realize that there may be lots of other ways of doing things.
Yeah, no, and the way I think I like to think about it is that it's, you know, that it's primarily a convention, right? Right, there's things obviously that you can put very straightforward costs and benefits on that we're going to pay this much to, you know, create some space or to execute some program. But when you talk about something like pollution, and we're talking about, okay, well, how are we going to measure, how are we going to quantify impacts on human lives, right? We're going to quantify lost life expectancy. We're going to quantify reduced health for a certain number of years. You know, there is no objective way to do that. Any way you choose to do that is going to be, right, the result of some kind of decisions you've made about this seems like a reasonable way to attach a number to something that is inherently not measurable in that way. And, you know, the way that we sort of come up with those methods is come up with something that seems like a plausible justification that also kind of matches our internal intuition about what's reasonable. And so, for example, with valuing the cost of, you know, the value of people's lives, you know, there was a sort of moment where at one point in time, historically, this was done primarily through talking about expected future earnings.
Mm.
And so the idea would be, if you die at age 40, you expected another 25 years worth of earnings. And so that's the value of your remaining life. Now, obviously, that's got some issues, right? That it means that, all the years that you're not working have zero value if you measure it that way.
Mm.
It means that the value of people's lives who make a lot of money is higher than the value of people's lives who don't make a lot of money. And so you can use that as a convention, but it has these other issues with it that people kind of tune into pretty quickly. And so, so there was a point at which people shifted to trying to identify how much people were willing to pay to avoid being in risky jobs, or how much of a premium do you have to pay for jobs that have a higher risk of death.
Mm.
And so then the shift is, okay, we're going to say, based on what people's wages are in jobs with similar skill levels, but some of those jobs have a higher risk of injury or death, and those have a little bit of wage premium. We're going to look at that wage premium and say, we're going to extrapolate from that and say, this is how much people value their lives because they're willing to accept this much additional risk for this much additional pay. And that means that they themselves are telling us, here's how much I value my life. And that becomes a plausible number to use. And that's also just a really weird way to do it because, that's not how people understand the world. People don't think about their jobs in terms of, am I going to have a, additional 1 in 1,000 chance of being killed in the job in the next 5 years? It's just a different convention, but it's a convention that sidesteps some of the issues that the previous convention did. And so we've decided that it's a good way to quantify this. And, we could pick something entirely different. We could pick some other, right? We could just change how we do this and choose a different, somewhat logical way of doing this. There isn't a right or wrong way, but the way that you choose is going to have a huge impact on what your actual outcomes are in terms of, what you think a human life is worth in financial terms.
Yeah, I really don't like that way of of measuring human life. I mean, for a start, right? The simple fact is that most people don't think they're going to get into a workplace accident, right? People just don't think that, even if they work in a relatively dangerous job. People completely underestimate their chance of a serious accident. We don't understand low probabilities because it is a low chance, and even if they correctly estimated them, you can't say that because like a one in a million chance of dying, I get reimbursed by $100. You can't say because of that, like, you could pay me $100 million to definitely die. Like, obviously that doesn't make any sense, right? Like, you can't pay me anything to definitely die, really, right? So this extrapolation of probabilities, right, is really bad. I mean, I have to confess. So we were discussing health economics earlier. We do use health economics in a way that I quite like in the UK, which is the quality adjusted life years, which is kind of similar, but it's about the effectiveness of drugs. So given, adjusted for whether if you're in a coma, your quality of life is presumed to be lower. So that matters. But that adjusted, your years of life adjusted for quality, how many of those are you going to get for the dollar you spend, the pound you spend on a new drug? And I feel like that's our way of rationing healthcare in the UK, like ensuring that it goes to everybody without cost spiraling. And there are, of course, there are plenty of issues with QALYs, but I don't know what you think of them. It's one area where I'm like, I feel like the economic way of thinking has been used quite well there.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting space because, like you said, I mean, it's very difficult to how do you really compare, like, what's the value of having an additional year with some kind of incapacity, that you didn't have versus one that is in full health. I mean, I think this is the case for a lot of stuff across the cost benefit space. Again, is that you need some kind of way of making these decisions. Right? The solution is not just to throw up your your arms and say, okay, we're just going to wing it, right? Like you need to come up with thoughtful ways of trying to quantify and measure these things. It's just that it's really, really hard to do. And there's a lot of different plausible ways you can do it. And it's always a messy political process. I'm sure, I don't know, I don't know about the politics behind the quality stuff, but I'd be almost sure that there's probably movements from disabled people who say, my life doesn't have less value, because
Yeah.
I have some kind of disability, right?
Yeah.
Like you should not be valuing my life as less. I know there was at one point in the US, like 10 years ago, I think there was a conversation around that was going to value, in kind of a similar healthcare context, provide less value to years that were like after the age of 65 or something. And of course, that created an organized outroar that people over 65 said, my life does not have less value just because I don't have, as many years left to live, or I don't have as much capacity as somebody who's younger. So you need these ways to make decisions. None of them are perfect, and they're all going to be messy. But it is interesting that the UK has gone much further with using QALYs as a means of making decisions about access to drugs, which in the US just get allocated based on whether you can afford, whether you have insurance that will cover the gazillions of dollars.
This is the thing. At the risk of presenting a false choice, I do prefer it to a situation where, I don't know, 10% of people just don't have healthcare, right? Which is what happens in the US. Right. We're getting into the weeds a bit here, but there is the ableism issue is a really serious one with QALYs, and I think for me, I'm okay with them being used ex ante, right? So what that means is, all else equal, to say that somebody doesn't want to lose an arm, that would be a deterioration in their quality of life, given that they have both arms. I think that's an okay thing to allocate healthcare resources based on, the prevention of people incurring disabilities. However, as soon as they have that disability, or if they're born with it or whatever, anyone who has that disability has to be valued equally to anyone else in the country, right? And that's technically, that's obviously extremely thorny, but I think that's the kind of nub for me.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
No, just coughing.
Okay, yeah, no, it's fine. So let's talk about macroeconomics, or maybe let's not talk about macroeconomics, because you focus on micro in the book, right? And I think a lot of the books that are critical of economics and the influence of economics, you can see, I would say most of them are focused on macro, right? They're like the financial crisis, globalization, inequality. You know what I mean? Economists have got this all wrong. They've neglected finance, blah, 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 climate change as well in the pandemic, right? These big macro issues. You don't really do that. Yours is rare in that you're much more focused on micro. So what was the reason for this decision to focus on micro?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest reason was that I felt like it was really neglected, and very, very important, in particular because of some of the stuff you said at the beginning, right? That the a microeconomic lens is one you can apply to anything, right? You can apply it to any space. And so, I mean, of course, macroeconomics is super important, and the role of economists in those spaces is also really important and has been historically influential. But as you pointed out, right, it's been discussed a lot. It's kind of probably the first thing that would come to people's minds when they say, when they talk about like economic advice, or what role do economists play in government. But at the same time, it's kind of limited to a handful of spaces in government which are, devoted to monetary policy or maybe trade policy or fiscal policy. So it's kind of delimited in its reach. And I do think it's interesting in some ways that that macroeconomics in some ways seem like they're almost two separate universes that just happen to be sort of sitting inside the same academic discipline, right? That you really can kind of bracket them out to some extent. But yeah, when you think about their influence, but at the same time, obviously, they're sort of full of people who are part of the same communities, and because people are in the same discipline, they have the same networks and so on, and
Mm.
so obviously they do influence each other. But it always just does seem a little surprising. It seems a little arbitrary to me that you would take these two approaches to the world and stick them under one umbrella.
Yeah, I mean, my PhD was primarily, it was kind of behavioral economics, but a database, so applied microeconomics. But the literatures that I was in, the life cycle literature and the social mobility literature, are quite macroeconomic in nature. And so I kind of attended both seminars, and I can tell you that they make as many disparaging comments about each other as any critic of economics does. Like the micro guys are like, macro, it's not rigorous, it's nonsense, it's too theoretical, they can't predict anything, their forecasts are rubbish. And then in the macro, they're like, oh, the applied guys, they're just looking at the effect of introducing, hand washing in a village in the countryside on, some kind of health outcome there. They're not doing anything important. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
there was plenty of criticism. They are quite separate traditions in a way, even though they share obviously some mathematics and like jargon.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there is, you're right to highlight this independent influence of microeconomics, which is under the radar because GDP's in the headlines, unemployment's in the headlines, inflation. So the decisions of central banks, right? They're subjected to a lot of political scrutiny. Whereas what goes on in competition policy, and maybe this will give me a chance to segue back to antitrust
Mm-hmm.
policy as well, which you mentioned seamlessly. It's like it's much more under the hood. I feel like it's just a bunch of regulatory agencies and government agencies have been staffed by microeconomists, and nobody really noticed until recently, right?
Yeah, no, and I think both the regulatory piece where you have microeconomics being kind of critical to making all these, right, both these like environmental regulation sorts of decisions, and then these decisions about how are we going to regulate markets or industries more generally, um, is is a really big uh, piece of this, as is just, again, kind of being able to take this broad lens and apply it to areas that are even less obviously economic,
Mm.
to whether that um, is some kind of social policy, or like crime, something where historically there wouldn't have been that would, thinking about it in economic terms wouldn't have been something that came to anybody's mind. But once you take an economic lens and you start looking at it through that, it gives you a whole new way to think about the problem and to think about the policy space. Um, but I'm trying to think about how to segue back into the antitrust, but I'm doing so less seamlessly.
No, it wasn't seamless in the first place. I've set you a hard task there. No, no. Let's talk about this, right? Because you said, and we can talk a bit more about contemporary times, because it seems that you hint at this in the book, and it's occurred to me. Is not just Trump, and we discussed the right wing and Brexit and Trump and everything, right, and the move away from maybe free trade, etc. But is Biden kind of pushing away from this, right? Because I feel like he's almost taken kind of modern monetary theory type policies away, which, and that's a branch of economics, but it's not the mainstream one, and it's not replacing efficiency with equity, right? It's a much more holistic approach. So one area of this is antitrust, and he's departed from the kind of Chicago school neoclassical standard of just consumer welfare. So yeah, I mean, maybe could you speak a bit to that, and the influence of like Lena Khan was mentioned in my chat as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I think, yeah, I mean, it's been interesting to see what the Biden administration has done and hasn't done. I mean, I think partly, right, there was a, yeah, I think so. I think some of the piece of it was that at the point that Biden was elected, he sort of very consciously said he was also going to take all the sort of the Bernie people on board, and
Mm.
which had a very different orientation, a very not traditional economic orientation towards thinking about policy, and say, okay, my cabinet's going to represent this full spectrum within the Democratic Party, and so you have both some people who are pretty conventional in terms of, their relationship to economics or sort of their continuity with how they think about problems. But then you've also got a slice of people who are, who are not coming from that tradition, and people like Lena Khan, who are coming much more from sort of thinking about it in terms of power and thinking about it um, in terms of caring about outcomes other than just consumer welfare narrowly defined. And yeah, and it's been really interesting to see what's happened on those fronts. I mean, I think there have been a lot, like on the one hand, you do see real policy changes as a result, but there's also been a lot of conflict and a lot of pushback around that. I mean, I think one reason is that because you do have this, this historical process through which these federal agencies have been staffed with people whose training is either who either have actual economic training, who are coming from a legal background that is more of a law and economics type orientation towards thinking about problems, that it's very hard to just sort of implement change from the top down. So even if you're at the top and you're saying, okay, I'm taking a little bit different approach to thinking about this stuff, I'm gonna change it, move us in a different policy direction. If you've got a lot of pushback from your staff who's like, yeah, that's not kind of how we're used to thinking about things, that's not kind of how we're oriented towards the world, that's going to be very difficult to implement that agenda. So I think there have been a lot of internal barriers in that sense. In addition, of course, to then a lot of these kinds of policies have also created a lot of pushback from industry as well, which is sort of the kind of resistance that you would automatically expect. And then I think the other piece that becomes complicated here is that action is also constrained by what it is that the courts are going to accept as well. So you can only make regulatory decisions. I mean, I guess you could make whatever regulatory decisions you want, but if they're not going to be upheld by the courts, then they're not going to, they're not going to withstand the test of time. And to a considerable extent, the courts have also kind of affirmed that economic criteria are the right ones for thinking about problems. And so, so sometimes you see these little moves that aren't very dramatic, but that are kind of trying to see what space there is within the existing framework for pushing things in a slightly different direction. And so, the one that immediately comes to mind here is just a shift towards thinking more about labor market impacts on workers as well as consumers. And so, there's been a lot of talk about labor market monopsony in the last few years. There's a lot more focus on thinking about how market concentration might have negative effects on wages as well as effects on prices. And so, so you're still kind of operating within this economic framework, but you're just trying to expand it a little bit and sort of push a little bit and say, well, maybe there are more things we can think about within this space that we're not currently paying attention to. So, yeah, so it's been an interesting space to kind of watch from the outside.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, I really like the more, I guess you could even call it more traditional approach to antitrust, right? Which just doesn't, I mean, it just sees corporate power as a problem in itself that may be abused in a litany of ways. Whereas I think the economic approach was to take consumer prices, right, and exploitation of consumers, and say, if that's not happening according to our metrics, then there's no problem. But I guess it seems to me that if you're looking at monopsony now, that's one. Yeah, everyone's focused on monopoly. What about monopsony, which for people listening is when there's a single buyer or a very few buyers, as opposed to very few sellers, which is monopoly. And the area that's the most relevant in is the labour market, when there are few people buying labour, i.e. only one employer in a small town, right, that has all the market power. That's like monopsony, right? And it also occurs with supplier relations with people like Amazon, where people are selling to Amazon and they're the only platform that's in town, really, right? And so, but there's even more issues than that, and there's corruption of politics as well, right? And there are kind of information issues. I think in the in the age of social media, there are things like who's controlling the flow of information, and there are very broad social issues. And I guess I for me, I'm willing to put my cards on the table and say I just think that the economic way of thinking, the Chicago school economic way of thinking, just needs to be displaced entirely from antitrust, because it's just way too narrow, and it's just a classic social science theory thing. You focus on one thing, that might be okay for your research paper, but you can't actually apply that to policy because you're neglecting so much else.
Yeah, no, and I think I think there's no question that there are all kinds of important issues about what the effects of corporate power are in the world that have just kind of been defined out of what antitrust is in the US, right? That they are just through legal decisions have just been sort of placed off the table. And you either have the option of trying to figure out, well, how do you open up antitrust policy in a way that allows it to address some of these issues that it has been precluded from being able to even talk about for the last couple of decades, or do you try to find some other kind of policy space in which you can tackle some of those issues that is outside of antitrust somehow? But I think there's no question that there's stuff that just, there's no way to look at it right now within the system that we've got. But the barriers to making it possible to do that within an antitrust are really high, because they're not just the barriers of having somebody at the top of the agency who's going to say, okay, we're going to start, we're going to start paying attention to the information consequences of having a really concentrated, media ecosystem. Because, again, we've kind of accepted in legal terms that you can't address that with antitrust policy, right? That you're not allowed to do that. And so you've either got to find a way to change the courts as well, or you have to, presumably you get Congress to act, and you could redefine what you could do in that way. But the space for action right now, I think, is fairly constrained, which is the reason that you see people kind of focusing on these issues like, what are the effects on wages, where you can kind of figure out how to address it within the existing framework, but it's maybe still leaving a lot of that other stuff, the bigger, deeper things, untackled, and nobody's able to really think about how to address those.
I mean, it seems like this initiative, let's call it the Lena Khan initiative, is having a similar problem to the one that Economist had in the 60s and 70s, right? Where you've got strong existing ideas and a load of incumbents and regulatory agencies. And I think if it's going to succeed, it's going to be probably quite a long process with a lot of setbacks, and we probably have to accept that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, and I think the other challenge is that the sort of the competing framework is not as unified and tidy in a lot of ways. One of the things that was working in favor of the economic approach to this is it's pretty well defined. It kind of tells you, here's the thing you're supposed to be looking at. We're going to look for ways to measure whether that's happening or not. This other stuff we're just going to define as being outside of our scope. It gives you a nice clear goal and a nice set of tools for tackling that. It lets you set these clear legal rules around it. Whereas if you say, okay, well, we care about all these bigger issues about what the downstream consequences of corporate power are, that's a lot messier. You can't just say, okay, here's how we're measuring corporate power, and we're going to try to create rules that sort of, minimize it or constrain it in some way. It's not as, it doesn't have the same tidy kind of technical framework to it. And so, so that's not to say that it isn't worth doing or that it can't advance, but that it is missing something that was an advantage when economics kind of faced the same barriers and sort of had to figure out how to expand economic reasoning in all these different policy spaces.
This was a central bone of contention for a lot of economists who were critiquing the existing antitrust in the first half of the 20th century. Right, they were like, if you go through some of the literature on it, they're sort of taking some of the court decisions, and the court decisions are really complex and contentious, and they're saying, the economists are saying, oh, look how ridiculous this is. 1 minute they're saying prices are too high, the next minute they're saying prices are too low, and it's like it's so ridiculous. Why can't we just have this very clear consumer standard where low prices are good, and more or less that's it, right? So it's like it does have that appeal, and I think it relates to like what James C. Scott called like high modernism, right? Which is just like this need that states and governments have for like a vision of the world, which is usually quantifiable, and which has clearly defined outcomes. And I think you're right. Like economics fits that so well as it exists, and there isn't really anything to rival it. And I'm not going to ask you to solve that problem now, but
thank you.
I'm just thinking we it's something that we need to do, right? We need to reckon with that issue somehow, if we're going to sort of change the values that are embedded into policy.
Yeah, no, and because I do think there's this piece of, when you think about sort of the rise of economics or the influence of economics, that's really about kind of the rise of rationalization, right? It's that I think it was inevitable in some ways that you're going to have this push towards quantification, towards trying to measure things, think about outcomes in concrete, quantifiable terms, and that if that didn't happen through the path of economics, that it might have just taken place through some other path, because there's a lot of affinities between the kind of stuff we're talking about and stuff that is, right, like, history of scientific management, right? Stuff that is really outside the scope of what you think about as economics in terms of a discipline, but that does have these affinities in terms of thinking about cost effectiveness and, thinking about quantifying as many things as we can to kind of try to optimize our outcomes. And I honestly think that is the nature of the world that we live in a lot of ways. And so I don't necessarily think that you can just sort of push back and say, okay, we're going to reject that way of thinking. I do think that you can do it more or less consciously and humanely, maybe, and really with an awareness of the limitations of your tools, with an awareness of the consequences that are harder to quantify as well as the ones that aren't quantifiable. So I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear somebody sort of make the full case that, that you should just reject this way of thinking entirely and replace it with something else. I can't imagine how that would actually work in practice. And so I guess, my inclination is more, well, let's examine the tools that we're using and think about where they work and where they don't work, and how to think about them better and in a different way.
Putting them in their place, essentially, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I was trying to imagine a sort of parallel universe where engineers took over or something. I guess you can imagine that, and I guess there would be some similarities even in the maths that's used, like optimal control theory or whatever. But probably some major differences in the outcomes that were focused on, and the way that they thought about how things work, right?
No, and I think, right, even historically, even in the US, like there were some moments where there were some of these tensions between, are we going to do it the engineering way or the economic way? And with cost benefit analysis in particular, there was sort of a competition between between an approach that was pretty much just focused on trying to put everything in a unitary dollar form so that you could sort of optimize in terms of dollar costs and benefits, and sort of a multi-optimization approach that tried to look at different things that you were optimizing on, one of which might be cost, but others of which might be other sorts of I don't know, maybe it's some particular environmental outcome that you're
Mm.
looking for, or other kinds of quantifiable metrics that you could optimize on that
Yeah.
aren't converted into dollar terms.
Yeah, like
And
physical resource flows and things like
exactly,
that.
and
Yeah.
those sort of got squeezed out, in part I think because they're just more complex and harder to do. It's
Mm.
nice to have one thing that you're looking at in the end.
Yeah, I mean, multivariable optimization is extremely difficult, right, man? Even in an ideal world, and
Right,
even in
right.
the world of mathematics, it's very, very difficult. Let alone actually in the real world. I'm aware I've only got you for about 5 more minutes. I want to ask one more major question, which is that so the book is, I think, consciously quite focused on the USA.
Mhm.
And this is a big question, so answer it however you want. But how do you think this has played out across the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, like, I guess there's different ways of thinking about it, right?
Mm,
There are pieces in which there are elements of the story that I think can be seen in many different places. I think particularly the parts where, that there's this pressure towards rationalization. I don't see any place where governments haven't had to deal with these pressures towards rationalization and think about how to address them and how to implement them and deal with them in some ways. I mean, there are ways in which the US was early to this relative to a lot of countries. And I do think there's, to some degree, there are these diffusion processes. Sometimes this is very conscious. I mean, the US in competition policy, for example, there's been a very conscious effort to take the US framework, which is an economic framework to thinking about competition policy, and export it to the rest of the world and send people out to
mm,
train other governments in this being the right way to think about competition policy. And so to that extent, there can be this diffusion piece of it, and that's kind of also reinforced by the role of the U.S. university system, and in economics in particular, that the U.S. economics PhDs are trained in the U.S. Many come from around the world, go back to other places, and sort of implement ideas that are
mm,
created in this space. But I also think, right, there's a huge amount of variation too, and a
mm,
lot of the ways that these things play out are specific to the U.S. For either reasons of local culture or very historically specific things, and they can look different in different places. And sometimes this is in small ways. I mean, you pointed to like Qualies
mm.
in the UK as being a place where the US just decided that we're going to not worry if 10% of people don't have access to drugs at all. And so didn't really bother to develop the same sort of rationalization system for thinking about cost effectiveness. So, a very specific historical difference leads you to develop a different set of tools in the UK that the US never really bothers with in the same way. And so I think there's a lot of spaces in which, right, local political institutions have a huge impact on how these things actually get how these things actually play out on the ground. And then
Mm.
I do think there's also countries in which there are other disciplines that have more influence, in which economics just isn't as prominent, um, relative relative to other disciplines as it is in the US. And I think sometimes that changes the kind of the broader space of policy making as well. So I guess it's kind of a easy answer, but there are ways in which I think these dynamics can be seen in many different places. But there's also a big piece of it that really is
Mm.
locally specific and historically contingent. You can do in
Mm.
other ways.
I mean, one of the ways I've heard you put it is like it's filtered through the politics of wherever it's implemented, right? So although it can be seen to varying extents across the world. Maybe the most in the USA, I'm not sure, but it's definitely filtered through the politics, right? And so the UK qualies would be a good example. That's economics as applied to a situation where you have universal healthcare, as
Right.
opposed to economics as applied to a situation where you've got private insurance, right? So yeah, and then in poorer countries it'll be different again. I mean, I'm reminded of Bhutan, right, where they pursue gross national happiness,
Yeah. Right.
which is it's a measure that economists do use. They do use the happiness surveys increasingly, and yeah, but obviously it's not GDP, so it's just adapted to that context.
Right, right. And so, yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of different ways you could imagine this theoretically playing out, and some of them I think would look quite different than what we actually see. But but at the same time, even Bhutan is trying to think about how do we find a way to create a metric that is going to allow us to make rational decisions about how to maximize this particular outcome that we find desirable.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I will let you go. But thank you so much. It's been so interesting, and I do heartily recommend Thinking Like an Economist to anybody who's listening. It's really, really great, and it's extremely detailed on the evolution of this mode of thought and how it's actually played out. So yeah, Thinking Like an Economist. I recommend it to everybody. And thank you so much for coming, Professor Berman.
Thanks. It was great to talk with you today.